Thanks. I am a grad student at Stony Brook University. My advisor is Mike Zingali. I also work closely with a couple other people at Stony Brook, Alan Calder, Doug Swesty, and some folks at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Our project on blue waters involves basically blowing up stars in so-called type 1a supernovae. The PI for that is Stan Woosley. We do that in a number of ways. So these explosions are, supernovae in general, are bursts of light that occur in the distant universe. In the case of the supernovae that we call type 1a, they have a nearly uniform brightness. So when we look at them out in the sky, they will appear dimmer or brighter based on how close they are, but intrinsically, they have a peak brightness that is roughly similar for each event. In particular, they're not exactly similar, so you can see this top slide here, top figure. They have a scatter like this, where it's something like 30, 40, 50% scatter in the brightness. But what's interesting is that the dimmer ones are narrower. So this is the brightness and the horizontal axis, and the horizontal axis is time. And so the ones that are dimmer, that have less light, are also a little bit narrower in how much they evolve. And so it turns out that you can scale these in such a way that they appear on pretty much all exactly the same curve. And so using this, you can guess how bright the event actually was, and then use it to infer how far away the event occurred. This is pretty rare in astronomy, where you get a chance to know exactly how far away something is, or at least to within a reasonable uncertainty. This was used, this tactic of using this to estimate the distances to galaxies, to discover that the universe is actually accelerating in its expansion 15 years ago or so. And that we call this dark energy, of course. We don't know what it is. Now, the real mystery, and the thing that I really love about this subject, is that even though these have been used for one of the most important discoveries of our time, we don't really fully understand what's causing them. We're pretty darn certain that they're caused by the explosion of a type of star called white dwarf. White dwarf is what the sun will be after its nuclear fuel burns out. So this is kind of a schematic representation where the sun is this big red ball now, and in a few billion years, it will run out of hydrogen, the fuel that it's burning to stay alive, and it will turn into a white dwarf, which is a compact object made mostly of like carbon and oxygen, and it's about the size of the Earth. So it gets a lot smaller once its nuclear fires burn out. So that's what the sun will be in a few billion years. And so it's these things, these kind of dense, inert objects, that are the things that eventually explode. And while we're pretty sure that that's what's going on, we don't know what's triggering it to explode exactly. One hypothesis, the one that I'm particularly working on, is the hypothesis that what's actually going on is that two of these objects merge. So this is an artist's representation of two white dwarfs, which again are these small, dense objects that are rotating around each other. Now, general relativity says that if you have an object like this, over a very, very long time scale, it will release gravitational radiation, and it will therefore lose energy in the orbit. And so over billions of years, this orbit will eventually decline, and the two stars will get close enough that they'll contact each other. And the theory is that when this happens, it might get hot enough and dense enough at the contact point so that the star can explode as a supernova. So this is one of the many hypotheses that have been proposed for this problem. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of observational data that helps us figure out among the many other models that exist for this problem. The theorists have a playground as a result, but it means that the most that we can really do, or that I'm trying to do, is understand whether this really actually works, whether you can blow up a star this way and get nuclear fusion to begin in such a way that it rapidly destroys the star. And then the next step, which some people are currently working on, is to connect that to observables and say, does it actually in detail look like the explosion I see when I look out in space? So I'm not going to touch that today. So if you want to do a project like this, in concept, it's actually not that hard. So what you would do is you just take some model where your stars are in some sort of equilibrium. They're just orbiting each other in a circular orbit, say. You put them on a three-dimensional grid. We use grids for our project, but you could also use particles to simulate it as well, and many people do. You would apply some sort of damping to simulate this gravitational radiation. Now, as I said, that happens over billions of years, and unfortunately, we don't have quite enough power in blue waters for that. So what we can do is like minutes, right? That's the type of time scale, or maybe hours, right? That's the type of time scale that we can actually do. So we have to put in a damping force that's a bit too large physically, but would nevertheless, you try to make it look what you think it might somewhat actually be. Then you see if that object, once they collide, becomes hot enough to initiate nuclear fusion and a detonation that just destroys both stars. And then again, as I said, what does the explosion look like if that happens? So to study this, I'm using the code CASTRO, which is compressible fluid dynamics code. It's developed mainly at Lawrence Berkeley Lab at the Center for Computational Science and Engineering. It uses full self-gravity solving the Poisson equation, an equation of state that's realistic for white dwarfs, which are mainly supported by the quantum pressure from electrons. It has the capabilities to nuclear reaction networks and radiation transport. I'm not going to talk about radiation transport today, but that's one of the things you can do with it. It's based on the box-lib framework, which does adaptive mesh refinement, which has been said earlier today. You can zoom in on zones that are of importance to you. It has a hybrid parallelism strategy where we break up the domain into individual grids, and each grid is then, if you have any loops in it, say, you would cycle over those with OpenMP. You can download this online, which I'll mention in a bit. So you can put your stars on the grid, and then you can just make them orbit, and you can do all sorts of things with it. As I said, it's conceptually simple. Just put these two objects on the grid and then watch them go. In fact, one of the reasons I love this project for my dissertation is that I get to think about all the simple things that I learned in Astro 101, essentially, and then see how they actually work in real 3D fluid dynamics. So things like Kepler's third law that describes the orbit of this object, the Poisson equation for gravity, all this sort of stuff. So we had to make a couple of changes to the code, to more than a couple, to do this project. And the reason is that it turns out, well, aside from the gravity, it turns out that there aren't many cases in astrophysics where you have just big blobs of gas moving through your grid, right? Like for the other types of type 1a supernovae that are studied, they're basically just a star that stands there and then explodes from the inside out. Now, there is one other field where you have big blobs of gas moving around, and that's cosmology, which I'll mention in a second. So we had to focus a little bit on gravity. The boundary conditions we had to update to get it a little bit more sophisticated. Again, if you have just a spherical star in your domain, you can usually just assume that as a point mass for your gravity boundary conditions. That doesn't work when you have two extended objects that are going to get quite wild eventually. I also changed how the energy is coupled so that when you have the gravity source terms, you would conserve energy exactly, aside from what's happening at the boundaries. You can ask me about that later. We had to make a number of changes to the hydrodynamics, and the reason is that for these equations of state that white dwarfs have, it turns out that they're very insensitive to temperature, right? A white dwarf is mainly supported, as I said, by the quantum electron pressure, and so when you change the temperature much, it doesn't really change the pressure much. And so there are a lot of combinations of pressure and density, say, that you might get when you do a hydrodynamics update that just don't exist in the equation of state. Like, it's not a thermodynamically consistent thing that you get out of the hydrodynamic state. So we tried a number of things so that we could get states that were thermodynamically consistent, and basically none of them worked. So I don't really believe a lot of what I'm doing, but that's kind of what's going on there. And we have spent a lot of time, a little bit of time at least, trying to use OpenACC to put our equation of state call in a vectorized form onto GPUs. We've mainly done this on Titan, but we could do it elsewhere too. One cool test that you can do with a problem like this is just to plop these two stars on the grid, but don't give them like an orbital velocity, just let them fall into each other. So we did that, and if your code works right, they should fall into each other more or less like two point masses would, just two balls that gravitationally attract each other. So the green solid curve is the theory for that approach, and then the blue dots are data points from that actual simulation. And so up until the point where the stars collide with each other, you get pretty good agreement between the simulation and the data. But it's a relatively easy test, but I think it's important to emphasize that you should do tests like this to make sure that your code actually works the way that you think it does. So I brought up this issue of large items of fluid moving on the grid, because in cosmology, this has come up in the context of whether a code that has just a uniformly moving fluid of gas has the same physics as one that doesn't. So from basic ideas of physics, it should be the case, we call it Galilean invariance, that if you have something that's uniformly moving and it's not relativistic, it should look the same within that frame as if it's stationary. But numerically, this isn't the case. There are errors that come when things are moving on the grid. And so this is an example of a particular fluid instability called the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. And the details don't really matter. But the point is that you can treat this thing, which happens after we've evolved the system for some time, as the correct answer, as it were. And then as you go from left to right, you're increasing the resolution of the grid. So this is a low resolution version of the final simulation, and this is a high resolution one. And then going from top to bottom, we've changed the bulk velocity of the grid. So the whole thing is just moving up, basically, but that doesn't change the nature of the instability, at least it shouldn't. Numerically, it will. This is basically a reproduction of something that has been done in other cosmology scenarios, and I'm trying to see whether CASTRO has similar behavior. And basically what you find is that you get things that really don't make any sense at all if you have a very high speed. This is something like Mach 70, which is way higher than I have to deal with, but does matter in some cosmological context, perhaps. So the instability that forms, like, it doesn't have any of the neat little fine detail that you get with these curls here. So the point is that things that are moving on your grid numerically have errors that you have to account for, and you can't really trust what you're doing unless you're pretty sure that this isn't affecting your simulation. Now, what we do find is that when you increase resolution, this goes away. So if you have very high speed, but you also have high resolution, you get something that looks basically right. But at low resolutions, this matters. And it's hard to know a priori what the low resolution is. So if you don't read XKCD, you probably should. It's funny for people who like science or math or geeky bad jokes about science or math. This is an old one about centrifugal force, right? You've all heard somebody say that centrifugal force doesn't really exist. And this is a parody of the scene from Goldfinger. Now, why do I put this up here? Because it turns out that a lot of people claim that one of the best things that you can do when you have lots of motion is try to make that motion go away. And one, as I just said, if you have lots of stuff moving on the grid, that creates errors. You want to reduce those errors. So one thing that you could try to do is to evolve your stars in a frame that's rotating with the objects. So if you imagine two things that are orbiting, just imagine yourself as an observer orbiting at the same speed. And in that reference frame, you would have the stars basically stationary. That sounds really cool, because then the stars aren't moving and all these numerical errors go away. And you can write down Newton's laws, basically, or the Euler equations for fluid dynamics, and you do get centrifugal and Coriolis forces. You can just write them right into your code. It's more or less straightforward. And so here's what I'm going to show you kind of as the main result, two different simulations. So this is two unequal mass white dwarfs that are just orbiting each other for 25 times their orbital period, which is about 100 seconds. So they just go around and around. If you watch it long enough, you get a little dizzy and it starts to look like it's going the other way. It's a weird optical illusion. But anyway, this is in a frame where they're just moving like if the stars are orbiting each other normally, like the Earth and Sun are just orbiting each other. So this is standing far away from the system, watching it happen. So this is 25 times of them just going around and around each other. Pretty boring. And that's what we want. That's good. This is what's supposed to happen. Now, this is that cool idea I just had about putting them in a frame where they stay stationary. They don't really stay stationary, it turns out. And then one of the stars just goes poof, bye. And then you get this weird behavior where they start like moving around and around. So it doesn't really make much sense. That part I understand. That should happen. But the rest shouldn't happen, right? That didn't make much sense. So this cool idea that a lot of people have talked about for evolving these things in a frame where they're not really moving, it turns out that I don't really believe it's that simple. It may be the case that there's a way to do this right, and that if you have them in a more equilibrium initial condition, that this will be better. But I don't believe that it's easy, and I don't really believe this. So, yeah. This is conservation of energy and angular momentum. Another thing you want to do, energy and angular momentum are conserved in reality. You'd hope that your code would do the same thing. I plot it in a logarithmic scale. And so this is just those 25 orbits as they went around each other. And so energy is the solid blue curve. Angular momentum is the dashed green curve. And so like energy is conserved over that whole period up to like 0.1%, which is pretty reasonable given that this is a very low resolution simulation. You get similar results, but a little more worse from angular momentum. But that's to be expected because angular momentum isn't explicitly conserved by our code. Only energy is. And this energy loss basically all represents energy flowing out of the boundaries because we have open boundaries. We don't have periodic boundaries like cosmology does. Another fun thing that I was able to do just because I could do it, it was easy to set up once I had all my software framework set up, is just to have two stars collide at each other. So it turns out this isn't necessarily a crazy idea. It's been proposed that you could have a system of a very wide orbit, and what would happen is that if you had a third low mass star far away, there could be some sort of, this is well described mathematically, a perturbation in the orbit that causes them to basically come at each other at very high speeds and low angle. and then just slam into each other. So this has also been proposed as a mechanism for type 1a supernovae. It's still the same two white dwarfs slamming at each other and blowing each other up. It's just a little bit different. It's less hard in a sense because you can just have them slam at each other instead of having to have those orbits go around and around for many, many times. So what you see is that they just slam right into each other and things get really bright and bad, and it's cool. This doesn't have any like nuclear reactions in it, so I'm just testing, what does the dynamics of it look like. But since I guess I have a little bit of time,
and is this for just like an ideal gas law, or is it for your equation?
This is the realistic equation of state. I want to show you a dirty little secret. Well, it's worse than that actually. It's really bad. So this is the same thing, but let me pause it actually. Can I pause it? Yeah. This is the temperature field of that same object. So white is high temperature and black is low temperature. Notice all that black. That shouldn't be there, right? Like that's what happens when we have one of those thermodynamically inconsistent states where we couldn't, like in the equation of state, find a temperature that matched up with that pressure and density combination. So the only thing that we can do is assign it like a floor level that is pretty cold, and it isn't physically realistic, but there's really nothing else that we can do. So it turns out, and I'll just keep playing, that you get all of this all the time with these simulations, and you have stars moving on the grid. Now it goes away. Eventually, they slam into each other hard enough that it gets really hot, and then it overwhelms the fact that you had to lose a little bit of energy that way. But this is a serious problem because in the other simulations I was talking about, the ones I was really focusing on where you have merger objects, what they're going to do is, as you saw when that one smaller star kind of dissipated, its mass just falls into the other star. And so it's expected that when a detonation occurs, if it does occur, it's going to occur in that low density region where the stuff is falling on top of the more massive star. That's the region where all this black stuff is happening, right? Where all the temperature's going wrong, et cetera. And nobody really talks about this because, well, one, not many grid-based codes have done this, but two, because it makes you not want to believe what we're doing, and so it's easier just to forget about it. So I just want to point this out. I don't really know how much you shouldn't believe this field because of it, but I think it's a serious problem that is worth pointing out that when you have lots of big stuff moving around on the grid, the hydro isn't easy. And only at very high resolution do these sorts of problems go away. But the resolution I'm showing you is is close to typical for some of the parameter studies that have been done fairly recently. So again, I don't know how important it is, but it makes me skeptical of what we do. But it's still fun to do this. Can I move on? So I have to do requisite scaling information. So this is a weak scaling test just using these white dwarf orbits. Basically, we scale pretty well up to 32,000 processors in terms of weak scaling. This jump is almost entirely due to the gravity, right? It's basically a big matrix solve, and so there's a lot of communication involved. So it's pretty hard to do weak scaling that's a lot better than this. Although we did notice, and I didn't put this up here, we did notice that if you turn off the I/O, and not just like plot files, because we didn't have those, if you just turn off like diagnostic output, like when we sum up how much mass is on the grid, stuff like that, we get from like 1.75 increase in time to like 1.5. So like for whatever reason, the communication just on that stuff is taking a lot of time. And so that prompted us to like do some changes to how we're doing it as well. So I think if you see something like this, keep that lesson in mind, that sometimes things you don't expect play a big role, do play a big role. This is a strong scaling test instead. The horizontal axis is number of processors, vertical axis is speed up, and the gray lines are perfect strong scaling. So I did one with 1 AMR level of refinement, and then one with 2 AMR levels of refinement. So strong scaling is also hard when you have big gravity solves. And there isn't really a whole lot that you can do about it. I mean, the only thing that we could do is to use a non-matrix solve for this type of thing by like, doing some sort of approximation. And people have done that. We might have to do that if we want to scale to higher processor counts. It's not really important for me to do. I don't need 92 levels of refinement for my simulations. But it is hard to get good, strong, like perfect strong scaling when you have these big matrix solves that you have to do. All of our codes, or most of them, are freely available on GitHub. You can just download them. This is CASTRO, the code I'm using. This is the sister code, Maestro, which does low Mach number hydrodynamics. I'm sorry about that. I'll go on the right one. all sorts of crazy. Right, so my code here, WD merger, I call it. It's just basically an add-on package to CASTRO to do the things that I'm doing, so you can take a look at how bad my code is if you want to. And so we encourage you to download CASTRO or whatnot if you want to play around with it. We certainly encourage users. We put it out there so that people could use it and maybe see if we're doing things wrong. So I'll leave this up here. This has resulted in one paper that we submitted that was accepted or published earlier this year, just on specifically algorithms related to the hydrodynamics, the piecewise parabolic method that I mentioned. And we're going to submit a paper on this test problem stuff that I showed you probably within a month. And then coming soon is the science part where we turn on nuclear reactions and watch everything blow up. So thank you.